So yeah, there is a real culture of preserving heritage, and it's not only government people that do that, but it's also private people like you, because you're actually also doing this. If I look at your tape collection, and you're not working for government, I mean, you're a private person, but you know the importance of your heritage, of your musical heritage. Americana music, I mean, of course, it's a very, very long story, and my book is lying there, and that's like 500 pages or more, which tells at least some of the history of Uganda music from 1962 up to 1979. So that is just, 20 years of history. So there's much more history, of course, between 1980 and now, and there's, of course, and musical history before 1962. But what I have been able to research is especially, let's say, the modern age of Uganda music. I don't know so much about the music before the 1950s, but from the 1950s onwards, I mean, I can say more than 6 million records were produced in that factory.
What was the name of the company?
The company was called Opel Tom Tom.
Opel Tom Tom.
Opel Tom Tom.
Yes, kati muganda waffe atugamba nti music watagulula nadda mu myaka gya 5 awo waliwo company eyajja wano nga yali yaba Germany bagiyita Opel Tom Tom. Netandika mu industrial area nga efulumya amayinja ago kwosa n'okubanga egatunda. Kale bwetu tuli mu kunyumyamu ku music we Uganda ye yawandika ekitabo kino The Soul of Uganda Through Song. Mulimu kirimu pages kumpi lukaaga 600, around 600 pages. Yakola interviews ku bayimbi ab'enjawulo n'ebintu ebyenjawulo. So Mr Mo, Opel Tom Tom was the first company here in Uganda.
Yeah.
I remember Christopher Sebaduka was one of the ambassadors.
Definitely, and Eddie Wamala, of course. Eddie Wamala was also working at that company. There were, I think, 25 to 30 people working there also. But the records that were produced there were not only songs meant for the Ugandan market, they were also for the Kenyan market, for the Tanzanian market. Even some of the records produced in Kampala went even as far as India. So when I talk about in those 5 years that they produced about 6,078,000 records, 78, that was a kind of type of records, they called them shellac records, and they were very brittle, they could easily break.
Yeah.
So in 1961 some Muzungu inventors, they came up with a record that couldn't break so easily. So in 61 those smaller ones were produced, which they called 7-inch records, and the 10-inch records, the bigger ones, which had...
Okay, kale tukyali ne Mr Mo munnamawulire ava mu ggwanga lya Netherlands, anoonyereza ku music ono, awandiika kwosa gwe ali eyo ng'olina amayinja ntuukirira, tujja kutuukako tubeere nga tusobola okufuna records. Kati agambye nti kampani eyo ya Opel Tom Tom yakolanga amayinja naye nga gamenyeka mangu. Era ntegeezezaako nyongeddeko nti we twali ne mugenzi Bernardine Subuga Ssemmango, yatugamba nti amayinja ago bano abasajja bakola ssente mu bulwagajjavu bwaffe obw'abaana Uganda, nga aba yakalikwata ejjinja ne limenyeka ate naddala n'akola ki, n'agula eddala. Mr Mo, do you remember or did you make research about the most sold record in Uganda?
Yeah, there's one record made by Christopher Sebaduka called Teresa. A very well-known song, which, according to my research, but of course you can never be totally certain because you base that on maybe an article you find in a newspaper. But I found like 2 articles in old Ugandan newspapers where Christopher Sebaduka is quoted as saying that record, Teresa, over a 10 or 12 year period sold more than 80,000 copies. 80,000 copies. Now, this sounds like a lot because most records in Uganda, when they came out, they would print maybe 300 copies. If it was a hit, then they would print another 300 and maybe another 500. And so mostly records that came out in Uganda would not go beyond 500 or 600. But I think the song Teresa, if you listen to it, I think you can understand why that song became so famous. I think because it describes a woman in a very funny way, and at the same time also in a way, the way a Ugandan man would like to see his woman, you know, the way she should look like. And I think a lot of people, you know, could associate with what Christopher Sepaduka was saying. So I think it's really true that 80,000 copies were sold. There are other songs in Africa that even sold like millions of copies. I mean, there's a song called Sweet Mother that sold like First speak a little bit about the copyright here in Uganda, because I researched that a little bit. I'm not an expert in specifically copyright in Uganda, but I know a little bit about it. I mean, the Uganda Performing Rights Society, UPRS, was started in 1968 by two singers, Stephen Sempasa and Andrew Chambade. Both are still alive, sometimes even performing still. And because they realized that somehow they were losing out on the money that they could make out of their music. So here you had two musicians that were good in creating these songs, but they were also business-minded. Not all musicians were like that. A lot of musicians that I spoke to from that generation, they made music just out of fun and maybe to impress girls, or, you know, I mean, they were not immediately thinking about money. They were already happy if their song came out on a record and they could show it to their friends and girlfriends and just to be proud. Now, Andrew Chambada and Stephen Sempasa, they had already been in the business since the late 1950s. So they had seen much more, and they realized they also had that same phase of just enjoying making these songs. But then they also realized it's mainly Indian bosses or Muzungu bosses that are making most of the money, and they thought, wait a minute, we also want to have a piece of that cake. So they realized we have to organize ourselves, and that's what they did by starting UPRS. And the only shame was that it was difficult for them to convince fellow musicians to also register. And because a lot of musicians in those days, they had two choices. Or they make sure that the songs are being registered and that they will get their copyright, but then they don't get the money immediately. So some of these Indian and Bazungu record bosses, they gave them the option, or we give you a lump sum now after the recording, but then we have the copyright over your song, or you wait until we sell copies, and if we only sell 5 copies, you're not going to get much. And if it becomes a hit, then you will make much more than the lump sum that they were offering you. So usually in those days they would give you like 300 shilling for one song, and 300 shilling was almost like a monthly income for, let's say, somebody who works for government at let's say a lower level. So that was very tempting, because
Plan B Records ye studio yokka ekuwa kiri ku mulembe. Oyagala ku recordinga luyimba ku Plan B Records. Tu recordinga nyimbe z'ekika kyonna nga raga, reggae, kadongokamu, afrobeat, band music n'ebika bya music byonna ebyenjawulo.